All right, earlier today, the House of Representatives in the United States passed President Biden's $1.6 trillion tax and spending bill. It includes elements to expand the social safety net, address climate change, and rewrite tax policies. The legislation now goes to the Senate, where Democratic lawmakers are expected to make extensive changes before voting on it, potentially in December. For more, we want to welcome Jared Bernstein, member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, to talk a little bit more about this. Jared, obviously a big victory lap in the House. Obviously, there was no Republican support. This goes to a Senate where the primary criticism amongst the Senate Republicans and at least one Senate Democrat is going to be how you pay for this thing. How do you pay for it, and do you need to pay for it?
It's almost not a matter of how as much as the bill is already scored as being fully paid for, especially when you consider the pay-fors from the IRS tax compliance. We know that there are hundreds of billions of dollars per year that are evaded through tax payments, disproportionately for those at the very top of the income scale. And this president just considers that profoundly and fundamentally unfair. Paycheck earners, they comply with their taxes to the tune of 99%. When you get to some of these more obscure forms of income, that compliance rate goes way down. When you factor in that pay for, the Building Back Better bill is not just paid for, it's more than paid for.
But the CBO apparently didn't factor that in. They say there's going to be a shortfall. Why the discrepancy?
So the CBO did not use our score for the IRS compliance. They used their own, and that's okay. I think what's important is if you look at the bipartisan support for those who have looked at this through the same lens that we have, some of those folks, including IRS commissioners who were appointed by Republican presidents, say that we're even conservative in our score, and they think that these compliance measures will bring in more than $400 billion. So if you simply look at the pay-fors as we have articulated them, as the House passed, and you consider these compliance pay-fors, the bill more than pays for itself. And this is something that we're getting agreement from on Democrats across the party so far.
Where there's also tension, Jared, of course, is the inflationary pressure this has, not just in the short term, but potentially longer term. Even if in the longer term we do see perhaps some pressure put on in terms of actually bringing people back into the workforce, that would help with the overall price pressure. But what about the here and the now and the immediate? Will that just inject more inflationary pressures when the lowest income can't afford it?
No, I think if you look at the way in which government spending is filtering through the economy right now, what you find is that the rescue plan, which spent out quite aggressively in 2021, is fading away as the Building Back Better and the infrastructure plans come onto the scene. But they ramp up quite slowly relative to, say, the rescue plan. Now, that doesn't mean they won't start creating opportunities and jobs and child care slots and child tax credits for families who need that money, cutting the cost of prescription drugs and helping families get by. But none of that is inflationary. And by the way, I'm sure you've talked to Larry Summers about this. He's been quite critical of the inflation outlook. He has said that Building Back Better is not at all inflationary, and in fact the opposite. Through the channels you mentioned, it will put downward pressure on inflation by increasing the economy's productive capacity and its labor supply.
We want to pivot, if we can, from fiscal policy to monetary policy. And there has been some confusion why the administration has waited so long to put forth some nominees for some of the other positions besides the Fed chair. Given how slow the Senate has moved, there's a real risk that the Federal Reserve is without clear leadership with all these vacancies. Why wait until the last minute?
Well, the president has been engaged in that personnel choice for a while now, and I think the other day he said something to the effect of, in a number of days, he'll be ready to make that announcement. And that's all I'm comfortable saying about that. We're pretty careful not to get into the Fed's knitting in ways that could create any market issues. We just as soon respect an independent Fed and let this president make that announcement when he's ready.
But this is still a relatively unprecedented number of seats that he has to fill all at once, at least in modern times here. Even if we talk about Fed independence. The selection process, by its very nature, often ends up being political. There's a lot of pressure right now for the president to do something to address some of the shorter-term inflation issues and, of course, some of the longer-term structural issues in our economy here. That has to be factored into the decision.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. So let me talk a little bit about the short-term nature of this. You know, in this White House, I've worked for economic teams like this in the past. I've never done anything close to this much work on near-term supply chain issues. We have a port envoy who's out there in LA and Long Beach, where 40% of imports come through, making sure they run a 24/7 operation. We're getting pop-up container spillover facilities around the port of Georgia with Department of Transportation resources quickly being deployed down there. We have dwell times, meaning the amount of times that containers spend in these ports, are coming down quite sharply. We're doing everything we can to address what the president has called one of his top priorities, which is putting downward pressure on the supply chain snarl, trying to help on the inflation front.
Do you think realistically that you will be able to boost people, draw people back into the workforce to be able to ensure that perhaps some of those supply chain issues are reduced? Because you can run, as we've said many a time, a port 24/7, but unless you have the truck drivers, unless you, I mean, there keeps on being this discussion that it needs to be seemed and deemed a more desirable job, but can you really fix it?
Well, I think that the labor force is responding in a big way to very strong labor demand if you look at simply the number of jobs that have been created. You know, I just looked at this number. A year ago, unemployment claims were over 700,000. Now they're something like 270,000. We know 5.6 million jobs have been created, 600,000 jobs per month. Now, somebody's taking those jobs. So we see people taking advantage of this very strong labor demand. And we think over time, labor demand will probably start to drift up as well.